Natalie,
Ready.
thanks for joining me today on an N of One. We have sorted out the internet. We've solved the problems of the universe.
What are you talking about? We're definitely doing this for the first time.
Definitely never done this before. Natalie, it's so lovely to have you. You and I have known each other such a long time, and you're such a lovely person to interact with. So I'm so excited to get to tell your story on an N of One. This is going to be great.
Thank you. Let's go.
The theme of the whole podcast, of course, is, as behavioral scientists, we typically look at large groups of people, trends, what's true for most people. But there's a ton of value in individual stories, individual pathways. And you've had such a unique, wonderful life. I want to talk about your story and your pathway and how you've made your way in behavioral science. And I want to go all the way back. I want to learn about little Natalie first. If I found 7-year-old Natalie and I was like, what are you going to be when you grow up? What would she have told me?
Boy. Okay, you're not going to believe this. I would have told you, little Natalie would have said, I want to be a child prodigy.
Is that a job? I didn't know you could pick that.
That's what I picked. And to be fair, no, it's not a thing you can pick. It's kind of something I discovered. It's not a thing you can become or are. It's more of a thing your parents push for. And that's what helped me fall away from that. But I was like, I want to be a child prodigy. Like in the 80s, there were the talk shows showing these kids, and I'm going to do my own horn. I'm very smart. I've always been very smart. And, authority figures tell me that all the time. So I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm going to be a child prodigy. I'm smart. I'm going to do this thing, whatever that thing is. I'm going to do advanced things. I'm going to show people how smart I am. And as I look at, as you realize, it's not a job title. It's what happens when a bunch of adults recognize more than what they think kids should be able to do, and then they make a roadshow out of them. And my parents weren't going to make a roadshow out of me. And also, there's not an achievement associated with being a child prodigy. So for example, that kid that show Doogie Howe is based on, he's just a doctor. He's not like a special doctor. He became a doctor at a young age, but then he just had a job as a doctor. There's no extra level you reach if you start out as a child prodigy. And I said, well, then I don't care about that. I was like, oh, if I can get someplace faster and then go to this extra level, great. But there isn't an extra level. Just because you're a child prodigy, you get 1% of your field, cool. But you aren't going to reach that simply because you started earlier. Yeah. And so I fell out of love with being a child prodigy and moved on to more tangible role.
Wait, what was the more tangible role? From child prodigy to NASA astronaut?
The next child prodigy, then maybe around 8, I decided on, I wanted to be a teacher. My mother was a teacher. I was like, cool, watching people learn is awesome. And then in very short order, maybe I'd say usually probably around the age of 10, I turned to clinical psychology.
What made that transition? That's a very young age to decide clinical psychology. What sparked that for you?
Honestly, I don't recall. So I remember making these decisions. I was a very insightful child. I think a lot about things, about others, about myself. So maybe thinking a lot about what I want to be. Some of those titles seems odd, but that's always the way that I've navigated the world, is thinking deeper. What do I want to do? What's out there? What's possible? But I don't recall what the catalyst was for switching to clinical psychology. I did realize that the teaching thing seemed limited because it's about learning, but I was always observant. I always liked people, paying attention to people and talking to people and understanding them. And maybe some TV show I watched I don't know about why I made the change, but I do recall starting to investigate the training path. And probably this falls in line with the whole child prodigy goal. My family had several collections of encyclopedias, and I would read those for fun. That may be where I found something as specific as clinical psychology. I don't think I knew it was called that, but I knew I wanted to be a talk therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to look at, well, what do I need to do to get that job? So my schooling was focused on that from very early on.
And that lasted. So even in high school, if I had found high school Natalie, she would have been like, "Yep, it's clinical psych. Off I go. It's clinical psych."
Oh yeah, and I even got more specific. I started high school learning French. I went to a college prep, so we had languages offered, and I went to a college prep in a neighborhood in Chicago that included the University of Chicago. So we were able to take advanced courses. Some of the not the professors from the university, but their spouses taught at my high school. So I started with French, and 2 years in, I was like, this is boring. And there was an earthquake in Japan, the Kobe earthquake, the big Kobe earthquakes. They were terrible. And I remember the news reporting that therapy is stigmatized in Japan more so than it is in the US at the time. And they didn't have enough trauma psychologists for the victims of the earthquakes. I said, oh, I'll do that. Okay.
All right, I'm ready.
And so I switched from learning French to Japanese, which was offered at my high school because a Chicago professor's wife taught Japanese, and she taught at our high school. So I was able to take Japanese. So already I was like trying to figure out how to specialize. I was like, Japan, trauma psychology. To every clinical psychologist who might hear this, I know what's wrong with that statement. I know. You don't practice that kind of psychology in a different cultural context. That's inappropriate. I didn't know that at the age of 15, 16. So that was my goal then. And later I came out of it realizing I can't help people who live and grew up in a cultural context that I'm only studying from afar. Even if I went over there and lived in the country, that's not the same thing. And so eventually I let go of the in Japan part. But
it was
school,
but was it still trauma therapy going into college? You're still like, hey, it's trauma therapy?
Yeah, because in high school we actually had an AP psychology course. So I was able to take and get college credit from the courses I took in high school. So in college, the clinical psych part actually didn't change for a long time until I was nearing completion of a master's in clinical before it changed.
And what changed it for you? What was that moment of inflection that made you go, hey, maybe clinical isn't because you, as you said, you were pretty far down this path.
Yeah. Well, so one, I wanted to do a PhD in psychology. At the time, I didn't know you could do a master's in clinical psych and practice. All I'd ever heard was PhD. So I was like, that's where I'm going. Right. I didn't get into a PhD program the first 2 times that I applied. So then I said, all right, I understand that what you need to do is prove that you can do graduate level work. Mm-hmm. Well, I can do that in a different way. Instead of jumping straight from to PhD, I can go do a master's. Right. And show it and then apply again. So my plan was do a master, start a master's. I didn't plan to finish it. Start a master's and then apply to PhD programs. Anyways, started a master's in clinical psychology. During that, I discovered while I felt like they were teaching us great clinical skills, they weren't teaching us any business management skills. I had intended to own my own practice. And I said, you aren't teaching us that. I'll rewind a little bit to high school. When I was about 14, I started making jewelry and selling it. A friend introduced me to the idea of making jewelry, and I looked in the shop with all the components. I said, this is cool. I'd love to make myself a necklace. My very next thought was, But if I buy enough materials to make 10 necklaces, I can sell 9, and that way mine is free. That's how I think, right? I didn't care about running a business selling jewelry. I wanted to make my jewelry free. That's it. That's what I wanted. Yep. So I started doing that. I taught myself how to make jewelry, which basically looks like making terrible jewelry and then one day making better jewelry, and sold it to classmates, to teachers, to family, just started selling it. It grew. So by college, I taught myself how to make a website. Back when making a website was literally writing HTML. I made a website for my jewelry. I put together small jewelry shows. And then also in college, I wanted to publish a comic book story. And I said, well, I don't have enough friends to buy my comic book. So again, to get people to buy my comic book story, I created an anthology where I recruited all these other comic book artists and writers. So we'd have a bunch of stories. Their friends and family would buy it, and then by incidentally they'll see mine. Yeah, so that's always my thought is, how do I explode? How do I make it easier to get my thing out there?
How do I get my free necklace?
Yeah, that's Natalie in a nutshell, right? How do I get my thing, easier? So in college, I was selling jewelry. I started a micro publishing company to publish this comic book. And I don't mean like self-publishing, like we made this thing and then sent it off to somebody to figure it out. Like I was in Kinko's, old people, you remember that. I was in Kinko's figuring out layouts, formatting, learning software in my school's computer labs, and doing all the layouts, sending it off to a printer, getting it back, selling it in comic books around my college town, comic book stores around my college town, on campus. Like and my parents are civil servants. My mom was a teacher. My dad was a train engineer for Chicago Transit Authority. I did this I just figured it out, right? And so I was figuring out how to run a business for tangible goods, which is easy. So you can take pictures of those things. You can give away samples. I made samples of the comic book, both online and like shorter versions we could pass out for free. I could show people pictures of my jewelry. I can make cheap versions that people can buy and take away for $5 or $10, and then showy pieces that cost several $100s, right? You can't do that with therapy, though. So I expected in that master's program to be taught how to do that business logistics of it, and they weren't teaching us that at all. And so I said, all right, well, much like the comic books and the jewelry, I have to go and figure it out. So I said, all right, I'm just going to go look it up, ask some people, whatever. Anyways, some of my classmates, I talked to them about it because I was an officer in Psych High, and they also wanted to know. I said, oh, well, I can teach you that. So one, I know some basic business management skills from running these two companies. The part about how do you run a clinical healthcare piece, that we'll have to learn together, but there's some other stuff that's applicable that I can teach you. And so I started doing workshops, and that's when I realized I might be better at non-clinical things. Because teaching, and this workshop strategic, right? Teaching is behavior change at a larger scale than clinical therapy. So while I was in school, one of my professors hired me. So I was a therapist for several years. I wasn't licensed, so I had to be supervised, but I worked as a therapist for several years. And psychology is the study of the individual. Sure, there's social psychology and we can look at groups, but it really comes from an individual perspective. And in therapy, I was working with one person. Sometimes I did group therapy, and that was up to 20 or 30 people. But I got greedy, and I said, well, I want to influence more people. I want to help a larger group of people in the same amount of time. At the time, behavioral science wasn't talked about in those terms. Behavioral science and mass behavior change weren't talked about in those terms, but that's essentially what I was like, I want to do something bigger. I want to impact more people, and clinical psych is limited. And that's when I made the switch and said, as I was nearing the end of the master's program, instead of applying to clinical psych PhDs, I switched to social. I said, listen, I've got 3 years of training on clinical. Now I need to focus on larger groups. And my training was it was a practitioner school, so it wasn't research based. I said, now I need more research. And I did a lot of research in undergrad, but I said this PhD will give me the research perspective, and social will give me that larger group perspective. And I already have this sort of business thing in my background, so I applied to social psych PhD programs, got in, started consulting a little on the side to really understand what is this non-clinical psychology thing. And that was my journey towards applied behavioral science before it was called that.
Right.
And cobbling together the training I already had with training I was getting ready to do. I'd also worked in between college and grad school. So I had work experience where my thing was, I'm going to apply psychology to this because psychology applies to everything, except one job I had for a couple of weeks. I was a janitor at Old Navy. There's not a whole lot of psychology to add to that.
Well, there's self-psychology. How do you trick yourself into not getting bored? This is
I can only say that's the only job where there was not a good opportunity to apply my understanding of human behavior to it. Everything else, I was able to force it in. I'm like, this matters, right? Yeah. And then I got to blow it up in my PhD training.
My wife firmly believes that my one true talent in life is the ability to not be bored by things. She frequently uses the janitor example. She's like, if I ask you to mop the floor, you'll do one half this way and one half this way and compare which one is like more efficient. She's like, you will make a scientific study of mopping the floor. That makes sense.
That sounds like that.
Did you, when you went into the PhD, did you think, hey, and then I'm going to go out into business? Or did you think, hey, and then I'm going to stick around in academia? Or how did as you went into the PhD, how did the balance of this sort of business, because, the sort of default assumption for PhDs is then you become a professor and you teach. Was that where you were headed, or tell me more?
No. So given that I'd always wanted to be a clinical psychologist in private practice, I was always aiming to be a practitioner. So even, and because I thought you needed a PhD, that's why I was going to get the PhD. I never thought about academia. I wasn't interested in academia. My undergrad was at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, great R1 institution. Man, those clinical psych professors there are doing too much. They were teaching. Yeah. They were actually teaching their courses, right? And doing office hours. They were teaching. They were doing research. I joined like 6 to 8 research labs, and they were doing serious research. I got training by the creators of very famous scales through working in these research labs. So they weren't just throwing out a survey and stuff. They were doing powerful research. And most of the clinical folks were practicing. I don't know where these people are created. I don't know what kind of support, to be fair, I don't know what kind of support systems they have. They did live in a relatively small town. I call it a small town. I'm from Chicago. Urbana-Champaign is a small town to me. For some people, that was a big place. But it was a small town, so they were able to have these practices and things. And I think one professor that I really liked, his wife was a stay-at-home homemaker. So those kind of supports allow you to do those things. But it just blew my mind. I was like, I don't want to be doing all this. That's a lot of business going on. But I was like, well, I guess that's what you do. And I just intended to lean more heavily on the therapy. So I said, well, what if instead of teaching now, I teach in retirement? What if I do that? Do therapy, and in retirement, when I'm done with all the stuff, I can go back and share my experience. So that was my trade-off, was like, I'll do that. So I have a lot of mentees, and I'd have to tell people up front, I was like, listen, I never aimed for academia. That was never a part of my identity. So for anyone who's transitioning, That's not a space I can help with.
Yeah.
I can help with what industry looks like, how to apply academic training to industry, but that pivot in identity and navigating the expectations of academia versus industry, I don't know about that because I didn't dive deep on that. So we had electives in the PhD program. I used them to take some business courses in the business school. I got lucky. Loyola University, where I did my PhD, they had an applied and an academic track.
Oh, interesting.
And I wasn't seeking that out. I didn't know there was this whole academia focused thing. Because in clinical, there's not really that. So
Right.
in other PhDs, practice is sort of denigrated. Clinical is about practice. So you can do research, but you aren't looked down on for either choice.
Right.
So I didn't understand that was coming. But I just looked out that Loyola hadn't applied in an academic track. And I was like, oh, cool, applied, right? So then I had courses like program evaluation, more geared towards deliverables, right, to organizations. And like I said, supplemented that with business school courses. So everything I did, even when I did classes where he said, okay, we do a practice assignment, I made sure it was an applied assignment. So most people, maybe when in our program evaluation, they would do a project for a university department. I said no, because in the business world, they're going to look at this as schoolwork.
Right.
And it's not going to be valued. So instead, I reached out to some nonprofits around the city of Chicago whose mission I believed in, and said, I'm leading a group of evaluators in a training course. So I never called it school. I said in a training course, and we'd like to offer you an opportunity to evaluate one of your programs or processes. And here's that. And I did my project with that in mind. I made a logo, a fake company name. When we did our report and presentation, we literally had a logo and all this stuff, and we did it like consultants. Yeah. So everything I did was with the intention of going out and doing this for organizations.
And did you think that it was going to be like that you would run your own consultancy, or that it would be a consulting role? Or in your mind, were you like going off to a big company and you were being, the head of process improvement, or,
honestly, at this stage, because this was a relatively sudden thing. So every other education and training decision I made was long thought out. This was sudden. So I didn't investigate what the landscape was for work opportunities, whether I'd be working for someone or my own consultancy. I had started consulting independently when I left my master's program, just because I couldn't find a job doing it, because I didn't have any credentials. In fact, I didn't finish that master's program, so I didn't even have the MA to back me up. I just had my bachelor's. And I didn't have a long business management consulting experience, so I couldn't get those kinds of jobs. And so I just said, okay, well then I'll just go get some gigs on my own. Right. I'll just do that. I call it, what was it? NJM. It was like Nat J's Mind Consulting, which was Nat J's Mind was the overarching name of all of my little business ventures, right? And I was like, I'll just do it. They won't let me do it, so I'm just going to do it. And then as I was working on the PhD, I switched up. I met my now husband, and I said, hey, do you want to do this thing with me? He's like, sure. So then I created a new company called Hallinger Life Management. Hallinger is a combination of both our last names. My maiden name was Hall. His original name was Ellinger. So I made Hallinger, created that, started doing consulting while I was finishing. So that was just a means to it. Like I couldn't get people to hire me to do things that I couldn't prove I could do. So I just said, well, I'm just going to go out and offer it myself. So all of it was just what I will make the access if it's not given to me. So I didn't think about, did I want to own my business? Did I want to work for a place? Also, because always being focused on clinical psychology, I wasn't exposed. I didn't know what a consultancy was. I didn't know about Bain and McKinsey. I didn't think to apply to those places.
Yeah.
I didn't know. I was in a new place, so I didn't have a goal. I was just like, I'm just going to do this somehow.
And to your point, just situating this for the audience, we're talking like
Sure.
2010. So even if you had applied to Accenture, it would have been somewhat unlikely that they didn't know what behavioral science was at that
Yeah.
time really either,
No.
right? So even if you
Nobody cared
had
about
known about,
psychologists.
yeah, yeah, even if you'd known, I'm not sure you could have. I'm
No.
not sure like there was the space. I mean, it was still really early days
Yeah.
with this as a
And
field.
actually, I can't remember when I discovered nudge and behavioral economics, but that blew my mind that there's now, I wouldn't say that, well, at the time there was a new name for it. So psychologists, so to be fair, psychologists have been working and doing the things that behavioral scientists do now. They just weren't called that. Some of it was limited to industrial organizational psychologists. What UXers are doing now was human factors, right? So UX is kind of a light version of human factors, right? So psychologists have been doing this. They've just been, one, they were more specialized, the human factors and IO psychologists. But also they go under other titles like human factors engineer. You wouldn't think that that's a psychology person if you didn't know about human factors psychology. So when I read Nudge and discovered behavioral economics, I was like, this is what I'm talking about. I
Here
mean,
it
I
is.
didn't agree with all of the stuff that they were talking about in the ways and the, what is it, paternal libertarianism or whatever the concept was. I was like, I don't necessarily agree with that.
Benevolent paternalism.
Yeah. And I was like, no, but okay, go off. But I was like, okay, there's a label for this. And I remember looking into the folks that got the awards, the Nobel Prizes for that, and and they were like, yeah, we're trying to get psychologists to study economics. I was like, why don't you try to get economists to study psychology? I think there's your problem. But they're trying to get social psychologists to study economics. Social psychologists are famously academia biased.
Yeah.
So asking those folks, specifically those, there are other psychology subfields, but specifically asking social psychologists to turn to economics and applied was the wrong route. I was like, you're talking to the wrong people. I'm applied, but that's because I didn't come from social psychology originally. I actually identify as clinical social psychologist, but more clinical because I spent a lifetime with that in my head. But I said, I want to do that. Schools were talking about wanting to hire social psychologists to teach that to business school students. And I was like, okay, so if I can't figure out what kind of job to do in the meantime, because I taught during my PhD, of course. So I was like, well, I guess I could teach the business school students, and that's a way to be immersed in that environment. Sometime around then is when I came upon your article about, what is it? Who's at your barbecue?
Oh yeah.
Matt, that's like, one, that was my introduction to you. Two, that has been the model for my networking since then, is meet folks in business early and young so they get to know me, so that when I share what applied behavioral scientists do, they trust it. They see it in their feeds from me engaging with it. They learn about it instead of having to rely on things like atomic habits and nudge to be the be all end all of what they know. So that if I hear what they're doing and I say, hey man, you're doing that wrong, they trust me, not because they've hired me, but because we have a personal relationship. And so my LinkedIn network is only a very small part of it is other behavioral scientists. Most of it is people in other industries that I reached out and said, hey, I want to share this with you, and I want to learn about your industry. Let's learn from each other. Let's share strategies. That's most of my network. And that's all you, man. That's all you saying, hey, we have to stop saying we'll prove it with our work and start with relationships first. That's been the guiding mantra.
I think it's a really uncomfortable. I was actually talking to somebody about this yesterday. it's uncomfortable for scientists because we want people to believe because of facts, right? Like in a Platonic ideal, we're like, I want you to believe this thing because it is true, because it is factually true, because it is
Yeah.
supported by evidence. And yet, storytelling turns out to work pretty well at convincing people to do things, and potentially better than facts do at times. And so, knowing
Yeah.
somebody and caring about somebody, and having, it was actually, I was dropping my son off at school this morning,
Mm.
and another car kind of cut a corner a little closely and almost clipped my car. They didn't, but they
Mm.
almost did. And I noticed that it was one of my son's friend's mom. And so I know her. And I was actually sitting at the stoplight thinking about how differently I would have reacted to that situation if it wasn't somebody I knew, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, in the moment, I was like, oh, there goes her, her mom. And then, but in the moment, I was musing about like, man, if that hadn't been her mom, I'd be really mad. But it's the
Yeah.
same behavior. It just is
Yeah.
contextualized in the relationship that I have with this person.
Yeah. And
And so,
it's
yeah.
it's not just business, it's everywhere, right? I mean, my comic book, right? I published this comic book for a couple years, and it started out as, I literally started it as a student organization on campus. I applied, registered a student organization, recruited people to come on board. These people were giving me their stories, and the folks that I recruited to help publish it for free,
Yeah.
right? Because we were a part of this group, and we all practiced and figured out how to do this thing with no expectation of compensation. Even when I took it out of the student org status and turned it into an actual little publishing company. Like, nobody was getting paid. I wasn't getting paid.
Right.
Right? No, none of us were getting paid. We were putting all of the money towards printing more comic books. Maybe there was, I don't even think there was an idea about one day we'll make money. It was like, one day we'll have thousands of comic books. That was, anyways. But so we all did this because we had a common goal,
Mm-hmm.
and the barest of social relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a bad way to get started. So people think about networking because I used to do networking workshops too. They think about networking because they're like, oh, I have to pretend to make a new best friend. It's like, no, you're not making a new best friend. You're trying to understand what you can learn from somebody, and how you can learn from each. If you think about how we can help each other, then that starts to feel transactional.
Right.
But if you think about it as in what can we learn from each other, then it's less transactional. Then maybe an academic can get on board with that. And you realize it is a mutual relationship. If you don't get along with them, then they're not in your network.
Yeah.
Let them go. They don't all need to be there. And so this idea of business people, they start out with projects and startups and company ideas or product ideas that they spitball with a friend because they're there and they're free. And that's how it starts. And so to me, that made perfect sense. And if you can frame it in a way that people understand, oh, okay, it's not so much nepotism and things like that. It's just that person is accessible. That's where you start. And if you can be that accessible person, like your friend, turning the corner, maybe in a little rush, maybe a little, worried about their workday coming up, then you give them the benefit of the doubt to hear more. It doesn't mean you trust them implicitly, but it means you give them the benefit of the doubt and a little bit of space, and you're willing to hear them out. And behavioral scientists need that because people don't understand this, or they think they understand it because human behavior seems intuitive until it isn't.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the hard parts, right? Human behavior is endlessly fascinating to everybody. Everybody, but everybody feels like they have some expertise because I'm a human, you're a human, I've existed with humans, and therefore I know this stuff. When did you've done consulting, you're in academia, you come out, and then I know you were Cook County Health for a while, like, and then you went to Literati, which was like your first director
Oh,
of behavioral science. It's in the
oh,
title, like, and
I
then
love that place.
what? When I know you had started to see Nudge and other, Danny and other people were starting to talk about this stuff.
Mhm.
When do you remember when you started thinking of yourself as a behavioral scientist?
Um, so when I read Nudge and they were talking about behavioral economics, and I couldn't get those, I still couldn't get those roles. And I contemplated calling myself a behavioral economist just to be able to get those roles. But I was like, no, I strongly identify as a psychologist. And I didn't like the idea of not being able to push forward that most of what they're finding is stuff that social psychologists already know,
Yeah.
right? Behavioral economics was behind because they weren't appreciated, right? They've existed since the beginning of economics, but they just weren't appreciated, weren't funded, weren't hired outside of academia. So they had to do a lot of catch up, and they were doing a lot of, from my perspective, as a social psychologist, renaming stuff we already had decades of research about. So calling myself a behavioral economist wasn't just I'm a psychologist. I don't want to call it. It's just no, I don't want to be associated with a field that has to rediscover itself.
Yeah.
And so that happened for a few years. And then one day, magically, somebody, I don't know who this is. I'd love to kiss him, give him a high five. Somebody used the term behavioral scientist instead of behavioral economist and opened it up to all, actually, we didn't call it behavioral science before, but behavioral sciences existed, right? Somebody used that term and opened up a role outside of specifically behavioral economists. And I was like, oh God, that's the thing. That's the thing. And then the job descriptions actually said anthropology, poli-sci, social sci. And I'm like, thank God. Because no one's ever asked for a social psychologist. Nobody wants that. Nobody cared. And suddenly they did. And they recognized the other behavioral sciences as having the competency to do the same stuff that they thought only behavioral economists could do. And I was like, yes. I don't know exactly when that happened, but it happened. And then it started to take over. It started to take over the behavioral economics roles. And so when I joined Literati, I was given the privilege of naming my title because I was the founding behavioral scientist. And they're like, but I was working in product, and they were like, do you want it to be a product? I was like, how about director of behavioral science product? How about that? I need to advocate for behavioral science. That was part of choosing the title, and show who might need to replace me or who could work on my team someday. Nowadays, maybe if I'd stuck with a product title, that would do me a better service, but whatever. Anyways, I really wanted to advocate for the area. So that's when I chose it. I don't really know when I started to see those behavioral scientist roles come out, but then I was like, I feel seen. I don't have to hang my hat under a different field. There's some people on LinkedIn that are talking about behavioral science as a field. I disagree with that. It's an umbrella term for a bunch of fields. I don't agree with trying to create it as a field, because there's so much rich data that comes from the individual fields going deep in their areas and pulling that out and sharing it with other behavioral scientists, that I don't think we should lose that. But anyways, that's a rant for a different day.
I think that's a great rant for this day. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because certainly I remember living through the behavioral economics area where people would be like, "Oh, you're a behavioral economist." I'm like, "Nope." Like, never took an economics class. Like, my understanding of economics is subpar. Right? Like you, I think the behavioral came later for me. The science part was very clear at the beginning. When I took my first job coming out of grad school as a head of product, I think my first title was lead scientist. I was effectively the head of product, but I wanted the title lead scientist. I wanted science. Like, the point of the thing, we're gonna science this shit. We're not gonna because I think it's hard for people to remember different eras. And once upon a time, product really looked like Bill Gates has an instinct or Steve Jobs has an instinct, and we do that thing because they instinctually think we should do that thing, right? Like, it was not, there was no science to it. Now it would be unthinkable to not at least look at the data or run at least prototype. At the time, people were just like, I don't know, this guy said it's the future, and so now it's the future. And you're like, what is that?
Right. You put money behind that? What?
Because he said so? Because John Ike thought it was a good idea? Like, that's weird, man. Weird.
Exactly.
So then you were in Literati, and then you also spent some time at Walgreens, at WBA.
Very short time. Very short time.
But that's a place where, behavioral science is a little more of a known quantity. There have been other behavioral scientists that have come through that thing.
Actually, so it was still a new. So I was one of the first employees to the team. So there was Robin Anthony Kuyate was the director of behavioral science there.
Who we're gonna get on this show. We're working on it. Rob and
Yes,
I keep going
please
back and
do. Oh
forth.
my God.
We're working on it.
I'm gonna say she's my team management mentor. I love the way she put together and ran a team. Loved it. But anyways, um, she was there. I believe she might have been their first behavioral scientist, and I remember the role because I applied to it. I was like, this is a big role. It would have been a little bit of a stretch role for me, but I applied to it. I did not get a call back.
But you got
But
to be on the team, and that's I think.
yeah, yeah, and I was very happy. I was like, that's fine. I was like, I tried. Someone else had more experience. I don't have any qualms about that. But she was the first one, and she was on her own for about a year or so before she built the team that I was a part of. So it was actually still relatively new, and they did have other behavioral scientists. I have a guy who reached out to me to make the jump from academia to application. He wasn't on the BeSci team though. He was at Walgreens. I think he got there before me, but he was on the insights team. Yeah. So they had some behavioral scientists there not doing not doing behavioral science, but they were doing it, right? Just like we've been doing before this whole boom came
along.
The
term applied.
Right? But I joined the team. So the team was fairly young. So we were still building the behavioral science competency of the organization it was fun because it was building in a bigger environment. We had access to bigger data, to big team, like divisions of teams, not departments, divisions. That was exciting for a person who's greedy for larger impact. I was excited. So that kind of thing, like, I don't care who's the director. Do I get to do some big stuff? I'm in.
Would you do it again? Like, if the
Walgreens?
Not Walgreens necessarily, but if the next, if CVS came tomorrow and was like, all right, Natalie, we want to take another run at it.
I want to do it big again. And I only hesitate at CVS because they're doing poorly. They're not as poorly as Walgreens, but they're probably right behind them. This is all insider and like I watch the industry. So they're not doing, but if a big company said we want to do a behavioral science unit, especially if they're like, we want you to start it. Oh man, my home is innovations, right? So while working on an established team, cool. But if you're like, Natalie, we don't know how to do this thing. We think we know, and we'd like to have it happen. We want you to figure out the logistics. I am an operations and logistics animal. Like that's my jam is I will figure out how to build this thing, where to place this, what's a real long multi-year roadmap of maybe we can't be doing this with everybody today, but we'll build towards that. And what does that look like? And yeah, short answer, yes, Matt. Yes, I would do it again.
There you go. Announced on N of 1. Hear me now, employers. Natalie is willing to run your team.
So one of the things I desperately want to do in building a team is get at least one of all the behavioral science fields. At Literati, he wasn't on my team, but he worked for the company. I worked with an applied anthropologist. Okay. And we would have regular meetings to spitball ideas, and he would frame questions that I would never think of as a psychologist, because again, psychology is about the individual. And anthropology, of course, looks at the community, the society. So I don't even know how to make those questions. And I don't want to learn. That's not my job. My job is to leverage the stuff that I learned and learn deeply in a PhD. Where I should be going is hiring somebody like him to work with me, not trying to absorb his information. I mean, I want to know everything. I'm a know-it-all, right? I do want to know the things, but I want to tap into that specialty, right? So I'm desperate for the opportunity to work with a wider variety of behavioral scientists in the future and really get that info, because people sleep on anthropologists because they don't think of it as a science. Two, they don't really know what it is, what it means. They think of it in terms of antiquity. And so, and not just them, right? Poli sci, sociology, all that stuff. I want to get that. I want to get those people. I want to leverage that. That's my dream. That's my dream team, is to be able to get people with deep backgrounds in one of those areas. That would be super cool. And I think that's what a solid BeSci unit needs.
Yeah,
I don't think I can recruit that guy, though. He's more of a digital anthropologist, a spatial anthropologist, so not quite the same. But I want your audience to think about that. We keep looking at people with economics background, marketing, psychology. I'm like, there's so many more of us, and their contributions. Like, you think, oh, I can't be that different, right? Marketing's just consumer psychology. No, it's different. It's different, and you need them in your ear.
Yeah, it's at Clover, the my qualitative insights person my qualitative researcher was a cultural anthropologist.
Oh, awesome.
She had a bachelor and master's in cultural anthropology. Maria Morel, she's at Oscar Health these days, but she is fantastic. And again, to your point, it's a very different competency, than sort of social psychology. It's ironic that social psychology is often practiced in a lab, right? Because it's ideally it's all about the wider world, but because of the way that we try and isolate, all the factors, it's often practiced in this very controlled way, whereas cultural anthropologists get to do it in the world. And so, they have a sort of naturally applied wider view bend. All right. So, so before, we can't end the episode without what company, like, as we're channeling the universe here, we're like putting a shout out. Is there a company that you really would love to go do behavioral science at, where you think there's just a majestic opportunity to sort of transform?
I didn't think about that, Matt. Well, I'm an impact focused person. Honestly, I wish, so the city of Chicago used to have a contract with Ideas 42.
Yep.
And then when Rahm Emanuel was mayor, and after he left, that relationship sort of fell apart. I would love to work for a government. I actually tried before this past election to work for federal agencies. I was looking at the FDA.
Not a good place to be at the moment.
No, like, I regretted not getting those roles, and now I'm not. I think it's I call it toxic positivity. Somebody I talked to the other day called it delusional positivity, of the always seeing the loss of an opportunity as direction towards something better. No, sometimes stuff just sucks. Sometimes things get worse. It doesn't always get better. I don't like, gaslighting people who live truly traumatic and hard lives, saying, well, the next thing will definitely be better. It's not necessarily better. But anyways, that aside, this obviously worked out, but I would have been one of those. If I'd been hired, I would have been one of those laid off. I would have been a probational employee. But I just want to work in a place that has massive impact. And so I was thinking feds, I was thinking city of Chicago, like, access to impacting lots of people. That's my limitation. I want to access lots of people. If you're like, I want to do this thing for this small neighborhood, I don't care. I do not care. I want to impact large numbers of people. So I liked Walgreens because it could have that massive impact across the country. So companies with big impact, large user bases, and cities and counties. And, I've worked for the county, Cook County before, so obviously I have experience with that. I understand that. So that's...
All right. You heard it here on an N of one. Cities, counties, and states, come find Natalie. She is ready for you. Also, big companies, Microsoft, tune your ears up. Natalie, thanks so much for spending some time with me. It's always so lovely to talk to you, and I think you've had such a lovely and interesting journey that I think can really inspire other people to reflect on, where they can take, the disciplines that they're involved in. And so thank you so much
for letting me do this. Yeah, this is absolutely fun. You and I need to catch up separately. At some point, have some coffee. And I can yell at
I
you.
am on it. I'm on it. I'm in Chicago next week, so I'm going to send you a note.
Ah, yes.
It's on my list. Today is my like planning the Chicago trip thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap this up, and I'm going to talk to Natalie about when I'm going to see her next week. If you're in Chicago, look her up. She's amazing. Thank you for being on N1, Natalie. It's lovely to talk to you.
Thanks so much. Take care, Matt.